Were you successful? Let's do it together. Let's create a new component here in goal input by importing React from React. And then here I'll name this goal input. And I just like this constant syntax here. You could use function goal input to create your functional component. That would be fine too. Then here I'll export the default goal input. And now here we need to return something. And that something is in the end this view with the text input and the button. So let me grab that entire view, return it here between brackets so that this is written across multiple lines and nicely formatted. And of course, we now need to again import stuff from React Native because we're using a couple of components from React Native. We are using the view component, we are using the text input component, we are using the button component, and I also want to use the style sheet component to set up my style sheet object. So for that, let's add styles here with stylesheet.create, pass an object to that stylesheet_create method, and of course take the styles from the app.js file. That would be the input container and the input, so cut both so that only the screen remains here. And back in goal input, I'll add both here to my style sheet so that this should work again. What won't work right now is that when we tap the button, that we add this. Because here, we now actually, well, we are not having the state in goal input. And when I tap the button, I actually want to do something in app.js. So first of all, we need to split the state. The entered goal should not be managed in app.js, but it should be managed in goal input, because that's where we have the text input in the end, which is where the user does enter the goal. So let's add the use state import here in goal input, and then add our state management logic here with entered goal and set entered goal, which we get from use state, which we initialize with an empty string. Let's add it here to goal input. And from the app.js file, I'll also take the goal input handler, cut it from there, and add it to goal input here. So this function in a function, which we connect to onChangeText. And now with that, fetching the user input should work again. Now for the button. When we press this, I want to trigger a function in app.js. I want to trigger the add goal handler. And that function should stay here because I need to manage the list here, because the app.js file is the only component which will have access to the goal input and to the flat list where we output the goals. And speaking of that, we can already import goal input there in app.js from components goal input and add goal input as a component here above the flat list. But again, now we need to be able to find out when a button is pressed in this component. And in React, you do that by passing the function, which the child component should execute eventually, as a prop to the child component. So here we could add on add goal. That name is totally up to you. It's a prop you define. And this points at add goal handler. Now this alone won't do anything, but on add goal will now be received as a prop inside of goal input. And it will point at a function, which means we can execute it as a function there. So in goal input, there, on press, I can simply point at props.onAddGoal, right? Because onAddGoal is that prop name I'm setting up here in the app.js file. That is received inside of goal input on the props object we're getting in every functional component. And onAddGoal points at a function, so we can pass it to onPress, so that onPress, or React Native therefore, knows that it should call this function when we press the button. That's how you do this in React Native. Still, we'd have an issue, because in addGoalHandler, I'm referring to the entered goal, and that previously was managed in here, but isn't anymore. We manage the entered goal, which is the text input entered by the user, in goal input now, and not in app.js. So addGoalHandler should actually now receive an argument, which is the goal title or whatever you want to name it. This name is up to you. And that's what we store as a value here. Now we have to make sure that we forward this argument when onAddGoal gets executed in the goal input. So that happens here on a press, and there we just point at this to also set up an argument which should eventually be passed along. We got two options. Option one is that we set up an anonymous arrow function here. Now this arrow function will be executed eventually, and therefore now we can add parentheses here, because this will now not get executed when this gets rendered first. Instead, this arrow function will be registered as a to be executed function for onPress. And now here in onAddGoal, we can forward the entered goal, for example. That would work. Or alternatively, we don't use this anonymous arrow function approach, and hence we can't add parentheses here, but then we can use another JavaScript feature. On functions, we can call bind to pre-configure some arguments which should eventually be passed along when this function gets executed. The first argument is always to what the this keyword should refer. This doesn't matter for us here, so we can just write this. But the second argument here, or all other arguments thereafter actually, will be the arguments received by this function when it is called. And it is called upon a button press. So these are now the arguments which are forwarded to the onAddGoal function, which in the end is just our addGoal handler function. And there we need the goal title, so we need to forward this. So therefore here I can now set up entered goal as a to be forwarded argument. And that's normal vanilla JavaScript syntax here. And now with this, it's getting rendered, that's looking good. And if I enter learn React Native here, it's still getting output here. So that all works, but now we split this app into multiple components, which is what you typically do in React apps, in React Native apps, just like you do it in React for web apps, because it keeps your components leaner, more focused, and your code more organized and easier to understand.